Hey, welcome to Thoughts Between Shots, a storytelling podcast where one great question leads to one unforgettable story. I'm your host, Nami Sarur, and every episode, I ask a guest a question that leads them to pause, think, and come up with a true story they've never told before. The whole premise behind Thoughts Between Shots is to help you become a better communicator through learning to ask better questions and telling better stories. So let's begin. So today's guest is none other than me. Let me explain. So, of course, every other episode, I'm going to have a special guest tell a very cool story. But in between those, you'll hear from me, where I get to actually demonstrate what a good question looks like and what a good story looks like. Today, I'm feeling especially inspired because I just listened to one of my favorite people, Priya Parker, speak live on stage. She was here in Austin at an event called the Austin Together Summit. I have followed her journey for a long time. One of her TED Talks actually changed my life. It was called How to Quit Your Life and Reboot. And that's exactly what I did after watching her TED Talk in 2014. I literally quit my life and rebooted. Cut to 10 or so years later, I've still followed her journey. And one of the inspirations for this podcast was actually something she does regularly on her social media, which is something called magical questions. Questions that everyone loves to answer, and also, everyone loves to hear other people's answers too. This was something I instantly connected with. One magical question I had thought of a while ago was, what is a tradition from your culture that you would love to teach people of different cultures? I love this question because it has so much to do with what I teach, especially recently, which is intercultural communication. And the best way to teach that is to tell you a story. So, 2 years ago, I did the unthinkable. I brought a white man home to meet my Indian parents. I knew that this was going to be a tricky situation from the start because for both parties, they had very little interaction with and little familiarity with the other person's culture. My parents, of course, have lived in this country for about 30 years, just like I have. But their socializing is mostly with other fellow Indians, and not just fellow Indians, fellow Konkanis, which is like a little tiny community that I come from in India. So beyond that, their interactions with Americans are either at work or just in passing, but never really meaningful connections. And my boyfriend at the time, Andy, who is now my husband, whom you heard on the last episode, I was the first Indian person he had dated. So he had himself very little interaction with Indian culture. I knew I needed to manage this situation. I needed to prep everyone involved. And by the time the evening rolled around, by the time my parents and Andy met for the first time, I thought the evening was going pretty well. Everyone was getting along super well. Andy was enjoying my mom's shrimp curry and even asking for seconds, which, if you know Indian moms, that's music to their ears. My dad was excited to learn that Andy had spent time in oil and gas, so he could talk shop with him all evening. Everything was going great until the last 5 minutes, right as we were about to leave. Andy was holding his cowboy boots in his hand instead of wearing them out the door. And my mom and Andy all evening had been talking about their shared love for writing. At the end of the evening, my mom handed Andy a piece of paper that was an article she had written because he had promised to give her notes on it. Now, Andy took the piece of paper from her hand, rolled it up, stuffed it in his cowboy boots, and my mom, horrified, went and fished it out of his boots and said, "Yeah, sorry, I can't let you do that." My heart sank because in that moment, I felt like, oh my God, everything was going so well until this point. Why? Why did it have to happen right now in the last 5 minutes? Now, if you're Indian, you are probably cringing right now. But if you have no idea why this was a big deal, I promise I'll explain that soon. This wasn't just your garden variety cringe-worthy situation. It was so much more than that. It was a classic case of intercultural communication gone sideways. Intercultural communication is basically just communicating with people from different cultures. It happens all the time. Even if you're not dating someone from another culture, if you live in a place like the US, you're very likely coming into contact regularly with people, either through work, networking, socializing. You're constantly coming into contact with people from different cultural backgrounds. And because of the frequency with which it happens, there's a very high likelihood that we could be getting something wrong. Things could be lost in translation. And you could inadvertently be causing hurt feelings, misunderstandings, or worse, especially at work, right? So if you're listening to this and you're wondering, okay, what are some instances where I can not screw up? Let me just dispel two myths. The first myth, which I've heard so often, is if you have an accent, it means you lack intelligence. Okay, first of all, just because someone has an accent doesn't mean they don't speak good English. Case in point, even if they don't speak good English, that's fine. If English is their second language and they're trying to work on it, that still doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. Unfortunately, a lot of people tend to conflate lack of language proficiency with lack of intelligence, and that's just wrong. Because these people could be perfectly brilliant in their native languages, maybe Russian, Mandarin, Spanish, whatever it is. So remember, if someone speaks with an accent, it really just means they know one more language than most of us. Myth number two, direct communication is the best communication. Americans and many European countries tend to favor direct communication. And I've heard this phrase so much, say what you mean and mean what you say. It was only recently that I realized that that is a very American or European thing. Because in a lot of other countries like Asian, Middle Eastern, or Latin American countries, they actually tend to favor indirect communication. It tends to be more implicit, and you're supposed to sort of read between the lines and read social cues. It's why if you go to India and people ask you if you're hungry and you say no, they will pile food on your plate because they assume that, oh, she's just being shy or she's just being coy. And this style of communication, whether it's direct or indirect, affects all sorts of things like how people give feedback, how they show respect, how formal or informal they tend to be, even their body language. So, probably the best example of indirect communication is the Indian head nod. My people are so averse to direct communication that instead of a simple yes or no, we invented a third head nod. So we do the okay. And the way to gauge where this falls on the yes no spectrum is to look at how rapid that head movement is. So that's IC, or intercultural communication, in a nutshell. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list, right? There are so many more myths to deal with and so many more situations where we could accidentally mess up. The best piece of advice I can give you, if you're wondering how to navigate intercultural communication and the uncertainties around it, is to heed the advice of famed 20th century philosopher Sir Vanilla Ice. When in doubt, you gotta stop, collaborate, and listen. Stop. If someone comes at you saying something that feels a little offensive or a little off, pause. Assume positive intent. For example, if someone says, "Hey, where are you from?" To some people, that may feel like, oh God, dude, you're not supposed to ask that. Assume that they're coming from a good place. Maybe they're just being curious. Maybe they traveled to your home country recently and really want to compare notes with you. Or maybe they're immigrants who have no idea that this is a sensitive question. Collaborate. If you work with a global team, which a lot of us do, and say you're the team leader and you have a different communication style that's often at odds with the rest of the team, it's a good thing to provide context and explain your why. So, for example, if you're someone who over communicates, just say something like, "Hey, I tend to over explain. It's not because I think you're dumb and you need it. It's just because this is how I communicate." Easy peasy. A little clarity goes a long way. Listen, it's your job as the communicator to be understood, right? And the best way to do that is to understand who your audience is. What are they receptive to? The best way to do that is to listen and to be curious. Conflict often happens because we tend to think that everyone thinks like we do, right? But as we've seen, I mean, if you look around, we live in a multicultural world. And with all these different communication styles based on different cultures, it's just not possible that everyone thinks like you do. So, going back to that initial example of Andy meeting my parents, he had no idea that taking that piece of paper and putting it in a shoe so close to your feet is a huge no-no in Hindu culture. So for those of you who may not be familiar, in India, we, especially as Hindus, we have lots of representations of God. And we tend to worship a lot of things that other people may find weird. We have a god of wisdom and a god of money and all of this stuff. So especially when it comes to books and articles, things that are on paper, we tend to think it's impure or disrespectful to keep it near our feet because that's dirty. Andy had no idea about that, obviously. And for my mom, I mean, she's used to being around all of us all the time. So she had no idea that going and fishing that piece of paper out of Andy's shoe was violating his personal space and his autonomy, which for Americans is a big no no. The evening could have ended on a bad note, but it actually ended up being something that we had a big laugh about because we got curious. We assumed positive intent. And at the end of the day, we understood that we have to explain context across cultures. So what we did was stop, collaborate, and listen. I know that wasn't like a full fledged story. I cheated a little bit because that wasn't the type of story that I would ask a guest to tell, right? That was more of a like a lecture. But the thing I wanted to demonstrate for all of you is the concept of weaving in stories into educational content. I mean, we're constantly giving presentations at work, or if you're a teacher or a lecturer, whatever. There are so many ways in which we are teaching things or presenting things every single day, right? People too often make the mistake of just keeping it super dry, adding a bunch of facts and figures, when really that's not the thing that's going to stick in people's minds. If you think back to what I talked about with intercultural communication, yeah, I could have given you a bunch of dry facts about, oh, like 20% of blah, blah. But at the end of the day, what sticks in our heads, what's the most memorable is telling a story that evokes an emotion. So for those of you who are Indian and understand the concept of like not touching your feet to books or paper, you were instantly cringing with me when I was telling the story of Andy putting that paper in his shoe. And that makes it memorable. It's those little touches. So next time you're giving a presentation or teaching something, make sure to add stories, even if they're short. And the other thing I did, which a lot of my guests will do as well, and a lot of good storytellers do, is you open a story loop at the start. Start with something we call a cold open. If you watch things like SNL, if you watch a lot of TV shows, they'll often start with a cliffhanger, right? Or they'll start as if you entered in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of the episode, and then it rewinds. So when you're telling a story, try to do that. Try to start with that critical moment, that inflection point, and don't finish it. Rewind. Go back to the start, go back to how that began, and then end your story at that critical moment again. And then you tell us the takeaway. What happened after that? What was the realization? What was the conclusion? It's a really effective tool to keep people engaged immediately. And if you want to learn about how to structure a good story, the best tool is The Hero's Journey. That's my definitive all-time favorite template that I go to. I hope you found that useful, guys. This has been one of the in-between episodes of Thoughts Between Shots. On our next episode, you'll hear from yet another interesting guest and their super fun story.